Snow fell softly over Oslo the morning the swastika was raised above the royal palace. The city, once filled with the hum of trams and the laughter of students from the university, had gone silent. German boots echoed on the cobblestones, their rhythm as precise as the machinery of the Reich itself. To the occupiers, Norway was a victory, a stepping stone to control the North Atlantic and a gateway to the Arctic. But to the Norwegians, it was the beginning of something far darker. Families huddled behind blackout curtains as German patrols passed. Radios were confiscated, printing presses seized. The king had fled, and the government was dissolved. Those who remained learned to lower their voices. Even the whisper of defiance could draw the attention of the Gestapo, and their attention was a death sentence. Yet, in the stillness of that occupation, resistance began to take root. It was not loud or brash at first. It was a series of quiet gestures. A Norwegian flag hidden beneath a floorboard, a coded message passed in a loaf of bread, a stolen German document slipped into a coat pocket. The invaders could control the streets, but not the hearts of those who refused to kneel. Among those who refused was a man named Leif Trondstad, a brilliant chemist and professor at the Norwegian Institute of Technology in Trondheim. Before the war, Trondstad had helped develop a rare substance, heavy water or deuterium oxide, produced as a byproduct at a hydroelectric plant high in the mountains near a small town called Rønneberg. It was a scientific curiosity, useful for nuclear research. But now, as the Nazis scoured Europe for materials that could fuel a new kind of bomb, heavy water had become something far more sinister. From Berlin came orders. All heavy water production in Norway was to be redirected to the German nuclear project. The plant that produced it, the Vemork facility, would become one of the most heavily guarded industrial sites in occupied Europe. Armed soldiers patrolled its perimeters. Anti-aircraft guns were installed on the ridges. The Germans did not say what the water was for, but rumors trickled through the ranks. The Führer's scientists were building a weapon to end the war, and perhaps the world. When Trondstad learned what was happening, he made a decision that would change history. He left behind his family, fled across the border into Sweden, and from there to Britain. In London, he joined the newly formed Special Operations Executive, the SOE, the organization tasked with setting Europe ablaze from within. His mission was clear: stop the production of heavy water at any cost. Back in Norway, the landscape itself seemed to resist. The mountains of Telemark were cruel and magnificent. Jagged peaks, deep ravines, and forests so dense that even the Germans feared to enter them at night. Yet those same mountains became the perfect hiding place for men and women who refused to surrender. One of them was Joachim Rønneberg, a young engineer and ski enthusiast from Ålesund. He had escaped to Britain to join the Norwegian resistance in exile, and there he trained under the SOE. He learned how to handle explosives, survive in the wild, and sabotage without being seen. The instructors at the Scottish Highlands called him calm, capable, and relentless. The kind of man who could ski 50 kilometers in a blizzard and still hit his target. By late 1942, reports from Norway had reached London. The Vemork plant was increasing production. German scientists, including Werner Heisenberg, were pressing for more heavy water. The Allies feared that if Hitler's team succeeded, the world might soon face a weapon of unimaginable power. The decision was made. The plant had to be destroyed. But destroying Vemork was no simple task. It sat on a sheer cliff above a frozen river, accessible only by a narrow suspension bridge and a single cable railway. The Germans had fortified it with guards, floodlights, and mines. A bombing raid was considered, But British pilots feared missing the narrow target and killing hundreds of civilians in the nearby town. The only way to do it was from the ground, by hand, with explosives placed directly on the machinery. In a smoky London briefing room, Trondstad spread maps across the table. "If we take out the electrolysis chambers here," he said, pointing to the heart of the plant, "the production will stop completely. They can rebuild, but it will take months. Months we can't let them have them." Around him sat a group of young Norwegian volunteers, men who had fled their homeland to fight for its freedom. They listened as Trondstad described the operation. Parachute into Norway, cross the plateau on skis, rendezvous with a small advance team already hidden in the mountains, and infiltrate Vemork. If caught, they were to tell the Germans nothing. If cornered, they were to destroy their weapons and documents. None expected to return. "Each of you," Trondstad said quietly, "carries not only the hope of Norway, but the fate of the free world. If Germany succeeds in this research, they will hold the future in their hands." Outside, the wind howled across the English moors. Inside, the men signed their names to a mission that history would later call Operation Freshman. But fate, as it often did in war, had its own plans. When the first British gliders carrying Royal Engineers took off for Norway in November 1942, they never made it to their destination. Both gliders crashed in the mountains, killing many on impact. The survivors were captured, tortured, and executed by the Gestapo. The Germans, realizing that the Allies were after Vemork, tightened security even further. Floodlights blazed through the night. Patrols doubled. Mines were laid along the approach routes. The mission had failed, but it was not over. In a small wooden hut high above Rønneberg, 4 Norwegians, Jens Anton Poulsen, Arne Kjelstrup, Knut Haugland, and Klaus Helberg, listened to the howling wind outside and waited. They were the advance team, codenamed Grouse, sent months earlier to prepare for the sabotage. Now, with their British comrades dead and no contact from London, they were stranded. Their supplies were dwindling. They hunted for ptarmigan and reindeer to survive. Still, they refused to abandon their post. Every night they tuned their radio to London, waiting for a message that might never come. They knew the risks. The Germans were hunting them, and winter in Telemark could kill even the strongest man. But they also knew that the fight for Norway's future, and perhaps for all of Europe, might depend on them. Far below, in the town of Rønneberg, German scientists continued their work, unaware that high above them, hidden among the snow-laden birch trees, a handful of their enemies waited, cold, hungry, and patient. The shadow over Norway had grown long, stretching from Berlin to the icy heart of Telemark. But in that darkness, small lights still burned. They burned in the eyes of men who refused to bow, in the frost-bitten fingers clutching rifles, in the stubborn hope that tyranny could still be undone. And soon, those lights would strike back. The cable was still intact. The factory still hummed. But far above the clouds, destiny was gathering its snow-clad warriors. The mountains of Telemark were merciless that winter. Snow lay deep enough to swallow a man whole, and the air itself seemed to freeze in place between the cliffs. Through the endless white expanse, the Vemork plant loomed like a creature from another world. A fortress of concrete and steel perched above a mist-shrouded gorge. Even in daylight, it appeared almost spectral, its windows glowing faintly against the snow, its chimneys breathing pale smoke into the cold sky. To the locals in Rønneberg, it was both awe and terror. A place where men entered but rarely spoke of what they saw. Since the Germans had taken control, barbed wire had encircled the complex, machine guns guarded every approach, and soldiers patrolled day and night. Yet beneath all that vigilance, deep inside the plant, something far more secret pulsed. The steady, rhythmic heartbeat of the heavy water chambers. Each chamber was a gleaming tower of pipes and valves, filled with the strange, slow substance that scientists said could make atoms dance. The workers who maintained them did not understand what they handled. They only knew that the Germans demanded perfection. Every drop was to be measured, sealed, and shipped to the Reich with absolute precision. Any mistake meant dismissal, or worse. Inside one of the upper laboratories, Dr. Kurt Diebner, one of Germany's top nuclear physicists, stood beside a German officer, watching as technicians in overalls took readings from a control panel. "Production has increased," Diebner said, his tone clipped and efficient. "If this continues, we will soon meet the quota." The officer, a colonel with the insignia of the Wehrmacht, nodded. "Berlin will be pleased." "The Führer has great faith in this project." Diebner's lips tightened slightly. "Faith," he repeated, almost to himself. "Science requires more than faith." He turned back to the chamber, lost in thought. He knew that in Berlin, Heisenberg and the others were struggling to build a functioning reactor. Every experiment demanded more heavy water, the key to slowing neutrons, to controlling the reaction that might one day unleash the energy of the sun itself. If they succeeded, the Reich would wield a weapon no army on Earth could resist. Yet in the back of his mind, Diebner felt a flicker of unease. The Allies were advancing in Africa. Stalingrad was turning into a graveyard. And still, they talked of miracles. Outside the factory, beyond the glare of the searchlights, the Norwegian night pressed close, cold, silent, watching. In a cabin high on the plateau, 4 figures crouched over a sputtering radio. The men of Operation Grouse had been waiting for weeks, surviving on scraps and willpower. Their faces were lean now, their eyes hollow but determined. Knut Haugland adjusted the dial, trying to catch the faint signal from London through the static. "Still nothing," he muttered. "It's been days." Paulsen, the leader, sat beside the small stove, feeding it a sliver of wood. "Keep trying. They'll come. Trondstad won't abandon us." The radio crackled, hissed, and then, faintly, a voice emerged, distorted, but clear enough to make every man in the cabin freeze. "Repeat. Message from London. Gunnerside confirmed. Hold position. Rendezvous in February." They looked at each other, disbelief turning to relief. Reinforcements were coming. For the first time in months, they allowed themselves to smile. The nightmare of isolation was ending. Somewhere across the North Sea, a new team was preparing. The men who would finish what the British gliders could not. Poulsen leaned back and exhaled slowly. "Then we wait. The storm's not done with us yet." Below them, at Vemork, the Germans continued their work, unaware that they were being watched. Local workers had begun to pass small pieces of information to the resistance: shifts, schedules, patrol routes. It was dangerous work. Several had already disappeared. Yet they did it anyway, driven by the same quiet fury that simmered across occupied Norway. Among them was Einar Skinnerland, a power plant engineer who secretly worked as a liaison for the resistance. Every day, he walked past armed guards into the humming heart of the factory, taking careful note of every new security measure. He knew the plant better than most. He had worked there before the war. But now he saw it through different eyes. Every cable, every pipe, every locked door represented both the strength of the occupation and its vulnerability. One night, as he left the plant, A German sergeant stopped him. "You work late, Skinnerland," the soldier said, his voice thick with suspicion. "Always the last to leave." Einar forced a smile. "Someone must keep your lights on, Sergeant." The German grunted, waved him through, and lit a cigarette. Einar walked on, feeling the sweat beneath his coat despite the cold. He knew that one slip, one wrong word, could end not only his life, but the mission itself. In London, Trondstad listened to the latest intelligence reports with growing urgency. The Germans were expanding production again. They were planning to move several barrels of heavy water to Germany within months. If they succeeded, the nuclear program would continue unhindered. The mission could not wait. He summoned the new team, Operation Gunnerside, 6 Norwegians trained in sabotage, survival, and explosives. Among them were Joachim Rønneberg, Kasper Idland, Fredrik Kaiser, and Knuts Haukelid, all volunteers who knew the risks. They studied maps, memorized guard rotations, and practiced demolition techniques until every motion was instinct. Trondstad's final briefing was quiet, but charged with meaning. "The plant cannot be bombed," he told them. "Too many civilians. It must be done from within. You'll link up with Grouse, enter through the ravine, and destroy the electrolysis chambers. If you're caught, you tell them nothing. If you succeed..." He paused, meeting each man's eyes. "You will have changed the course of history." Back in Norway, the men of Grouse prepared for their arrival. The wind howled outside their cabin, tearing at the roof. Snow fell so heavily that even their own tracks vanished within minutes. They hunted reindeer when they could, boiled pine needles for tea, and prayed the weather would ease long enough for a parachute drop. Finally, one night in February 1943, they heard it. The distant drone of an aircraft, somewhere above the clouds. The men rushed outside, staring into the blizzard. A speck of darkness against the snow. Parachutes opened. 1, 2, 3, then more. Rønneberg and his team hit the ground hard, but alive. Within hours, they had located the Grouse team. The reunion was wordless at first, a mix of exhaustion, disbelief, and quiet joy. Men who had lived as ghosts for months now stood face to face with the comrades who would carry their mission to completion. Inside the cabin, as they thawed by the fire, Rønneberg spread the blueprints of Vemork on the table. "We go in through the gorge," he said. "It's steep, but they won't expect it. If we can reach the cable bridge undetected, we can be inside the plant before they know we're there." Poulsen nodded. "And if they do?" Rønneberg looked up, eyes hard. "Then we don't come back." Outside, the snow kept falling, veiling the mountains in silence. Below them, the Vemork plant continued to hum, oblivious to the danger, creeping closer through the darkness. The men of the Gunnerside team slept little that night. They knew what awaited them. Cliffs, mines, machine guns, and the possibility of capture. Yet none wavered. The factory above the clouds was no longer just a German stronghold. It was a symbol of power, of oppression, of the fragile line between science and destruction. And in the days to come, it would become the stage for one of the most daring acts of sabotage in history. As dawn rose over the frozen gorge, the snow reflected a faint pink glow. Deep within the mountains, the resistance prepared to move. Silent shadows against an empire of steel. The wind screamed over the Hardangervidda plateau, turning the night sky into a swirling white abyss. Far below, 4 dark shapes drifted silently through the storm, parachutes billowing like ghosts against the snow. Each man clutched his pack, heart pounding, as the endless wilderness rushed up to meet him. The pilot's final words before the jump still echoed in their ears. Good luck, lads. Norway's counting on you. When the first man hit the ground, the shock of the landing nearly drove the breath from his lungs. Snow exploded around him, cold and blinding. He yanked at the cords, fighting to free himself before the wind dragged the parachute across the ice. One by one, the others landed nearby, their shouts muffled by the gale. They were the advance party, Operation Grouse, sent months ahead of any main force to prepare the ground for an assault on the Vemork plant. 4 Norwegians, Jens Anton Poulsen, Arne Kjelstrup, Knut Haugland, and Klaus Helberg. Young, tough, and trained by the British SOE. They were armed not just with weapons, but with endurance, the kind born from a lifetime in the mountains. As the aircraft disappeared into the storm, the silence of Telemark closed in around them. Endless snow. No landmarks, no lights, only the sound of wind and their own ragged breathing. They gathered their supplies, food, radios, weapons, and coded instructions, then began the long march toward their designated hideout, a small mountain hut near Rønneberg. Each step through the snow felt heavier than the last. The packs weighed nearly 30 kilograms, and the temperature had dropped to nearly minus 30 degrees Celsius. The landscape was both breathtaking and merciless. Rolling white plains broken by dark clusters of birch trees, frozen rivers like ribbons of glass, and cliffs that seemed to rise straight into the clouds. They moved mostly by night, sleeping under the cover of rock outcrops or in snow caves they carved themselves. The men spoke little, conserving their breath, though the occasional bit of gallows humor broke the monotony. "Remind me again," Helberg muttered one evening as they huddled over a flickering stove. "Why we volunteered to freeze to death before even meeting the enemy." Haugland grinned faintly through cracked lips. "Because we're stubborn fools who hate being told Norway belongs to anyone else." The laughter that followed was short but genuine. It was the kind of defiance that kept them alive. After a week of brutal travel, they reached the upper slopes overlooking the valley of Rønneberg. Below them, smoke rose faintly from the town, the breath of the Vemork plant. The fortress stood like a beast among the cliffs, its light stabbing through the mist. Even from miles away, they could sense its power. "This is it," Poulsen said quietly. "From now on, we move like shadows." They found a small abandoned cabin near Lake Mosvatn and set up camp. Here, they would wait for the British gliders carrying the Royal Engineers, the second phase of the operation, codenamed Freshmen. Their task was to guide the British team to Vemork, provide intelligence, and assist with the sabotage itself. But before the British arrived, they had to survive. The Norwegian winter showed no mercy. Food dwindled quickly. The radio, their only link to London, crackled with static, but carried no messages. The men took turns on watch, listening to the wind howl over the plateau. Days turned into weeks. Their faces grew gaunt, their beards thick. They trapped ptarmigan when they could and boiled snow for water. On one of the rare clear mornings, Helberg climbed a ridge and scanned the horizon with binoculars. He could see the valley far below, the German trucks moving like black beetles along the road, and the Vemork plant gleaming in the pale sun. "They've tightened security," he said when he returned. "Guards everywhere. Even the bridge looks reinforced." Poulsen nodded grimly. "That means they're afraid." "That's something." The next night, Haugland managed to make brief contact with London. The coded message was short, but enough to raise their spirits. "Freshmen en route. Prepare for signal, finally." The waiting was almost over. They built a signal beacon from branches and rags soaked in fuel, ready to light when the British gliders appeared. On the night of November 19th, 1942, they gathered outside the hut, eyes fixed on the sky. The wind had picked up again, tearing through the pines like a living thing. Then, faintly, they heard it. The distant drone of engines above the clouds. Helberg's face broke into a grin. "They're here." But the sound wavered, grew louder, then fainter again. The men waited, tense, as the storm intensified. Somewhere up there, 2 Halifax bombers were towing gliders filled with British engineers and equipment. They were supposed to land on the frozen plateau, guided by Grouse's signal. Minutes passed, then hours. The engines faded into the distance, swallowed by the storm. When dawn broke, the plateau was silent again. No gliders, no planes, only the empty sky. Over the next day, the truth came through the radio. Broken, incomplete, devastating. Both gliders had crashed. Survivors had been captured by the Germans. Every one of them had been executed under Hitler's commando order. The mission had failed. For a long time, none of the 4 spoke. The loss was heavy, not just for their comrades, but for the operation itself. Without the British explosives and manpower, how could they possibly attack Vemork? Finally, Poulsen stood. "We don't leave," he said. "We stay. We survive. London will try again, and when they do, we'll be ready." The others nodded. It was madness. But it was also resolve. The weeks that followed tested them more than any battlefield could. Supplies dwindled to almost nothing. They hunted reindeer with makeshift traps, ate bark when meat ran out, and melted snow over tiny fires to stay alive. Yet they refused to give up. Each morning, they rose to the same bitter wind and the same promise. They were still alive, and the mission was not finished. Sometimes they talked about home, about the towns they'd left behind, the families they couldn't contact. Other times they sat in silence, watching the snow fall endlessly outside their cabin door. On one especially harsh night, the temperature dropped so low that the oil in their radio froze. Haugland tried to fix it, his fingers trembling from cold. "If we lose this," he muttered, "we might as well be dead." He managed to get it working again, and that small victory lifted their spirits more than food could have. By late January 1943, the 4 men had become part of the mountain itself. Ghosts moving through blizzards, unseen and unstoppable. They had memorized every ridge, every frozen stream, every sound the wind made when it blew through the pines. They were no longer just soldiers. They were survivors forged by the wilderness. And then, one night in early February, the radio came alive again. "New team incoming. Gunnerside confirmed. Hold position for rendezvous." The 4 men stared at each other. Relief, disbelief, and grim determination mixed in their faces. London had not forgotten them. A new team, 6 more Norwegians trained in sabotage, was coming. Poulsen's voice was steady as he spoke. "Then this is it. We've waited long enough. We'll bring them home." Outside, the storm raged once more. But this time, the men of Grouse no longer feared it. The mountains had tested them and found them worthy. The snow was their shield, the cold their ally. Somewhere across the sea, their brothers in arms were already on their way, carrying the hope of Europe in their packs. And when they arrived, the 4 who had survived the impossible would lead them to the heart of Vemork itself. The mountains slept beneath the northern lights that night, unaware that history was already stirring in their shadows. The wind came howling down from the Hardangervidda like a living thing, clawing at the snow and bending the birch trees until they snapped. It was late December 1942, and the mountains had become a frozen wasteland, a place where even wolves dared not roam. For the 4 men of Operation Grouse, the wilderness was both their prison and their shield. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the Germans patrolled the valleys, while above them, blizzards smothered the sun and erased every trail within minutes. Inside their tiny mountain hut, the air stank of smoke and sweat. Frost rimed the walls, turning their breath into a ghostly haze. Jens Anton Poulsen sat hunched over a small map, the paper soft and creased from handling. Across from him, Knut Haugland worked on their radio, coaxing life back into the stubborn machine with frozen fingers. Klaus Hellberg scraped frost from the inside of the window, while Arne Kjellstrup sat by the stove, sharpening a knife that hadn't seen action in months. The storm outside had been raging for 3 days. No signals could get through the interference. Their food was nearly gone. A few handfuls of oatmeal, a strip of dried reindeer meat, and a tin of cocoa they guarded like treasure. Each day they rationed themselves to one small meal, just enough to keep moving. "London hasn't sent word," Haugland muttered, slapping the side of the radio. "Not a whisper. Maybe they think we're dead." Poulsen didn't look up. "Then we'll remind them we're not." He spoke quietly, but the words carried an iron calm. It was that calm, his steady voice in the face of despair, that kept the others from unraveling. Still, even he could feel the weight of the silence pressing on them. They were hundreds of kilometers from any friendly face, and the last attempt to reach them, Operation Freshman, had ended in tragedy. 2 British gliders had crashed in the storm. Those who survived had been captured and executed. Sometimes at night, the men dreamed of the sound of engines overhead, only to wake and remember that the sky above Norway belonged to the Luftwaffe. The blizzard eased on the 4th day, revealing a white, endless stillness. The snow had piled waist-deep outside their hut. The men took it as a sign, a chance to move, to hunt, to breathe something other than smoke and fear. Hellberg slung his rifle over his shoulder. "We need food. If I head north toward the ridge, I might find reindeer tracks." Kjellstrup nodded. "Take the sled. The ice looks solid today." And watch for German patrols, Hellberg gave a grim smile. "Out here? Only fools and Norwegians would be this far in winter." He vanished into the whiteness, his figure swallowed by the snow. Hours passed before he returned, face raw from the wind and beard coated in frost. Over his shoulder hung a small reindeer, its lifeless eyes glazed with ice. The men cheered, a rare sound in that bleak winter, and within minutes, the scent of roasting meat filled the hut. It wasn't much, but for the first time in weeks, they ate until they were full. That night, as the fire crackled, Poulsen unfolded a letter he had written weeks earlier but never sent. A note addressed to his family. He didn't read it aloud, but his eyes lingered on it for a long moment before he tucked it away again. The war had stripped away the idea of home, yet it was the thought of home that kept them alive. The next morning, a faint hum reached their ears, a sound that sent every man rushing outside. They scanned the horizon. For a moment, nothing. Then, faintly against the sky, the shape of an aircraft appeared, and then another. Haugland's heart leapt. It must be them. The second attempt. They grabbed their signal flares, scrambling up the ridge to light them. Flames cut through the gray air, orange against the white. The planes droned lower, but something was wrong. They were too far south. And then, just as suddenly as they'd appeared, the aircraft turned and vanished into the clouds. Hours later, London confirmed what the men already feared. There had been no second drop. The radio signal they'd caught had been misinterpreted. They were still alone. For days afterward, despair crept into their camp like frost through cracks in the walls. The storm returned, burying their tracks and trapping them again. Haugland stared into the fire one night and said softly, "We're ghosts now. Norway's forgotten us." Poulsen shook his head. "Not forgotten. Waiting. The Germans haven't won yet, and neither have we." Helberg gave a bitter laugh. "You think anyone in London still cares about 4 men freezing in the mountains?" "Trondstad cares," Poulsen said. "And if he's alive, he'll find a way to reach us." Outside, the wind wailed like the cry of something ancient. By January, frostbite had taken 2 of Kjellstrup's toes. He bore it in silence, grimacing as Helberg dressed the wound with strips of cloth torn from an old uniform. Their supplies were almost gone again, and hunting grew harder with each passing week. The reindeer had moved lower into the valleys, where German patrols now scouted for resistance. One night they risked lighting a larger fire, a beacon of warmth in the endless dark. They sat close, sharing the last of their cocoa. "Remember what it was like before the war?" Haugland asked quietly. "When we used to ski for fun, not for our lives?" Poulsen smiled faintly. "I remember thinking that mountains were just beautiful. Not deadly." Helberg stared into the flames. "Now I can't look at snow without wondering what's buried underneath it." The silence that followed was not heavy, but solemn. A kind of shared understanding that only men who had looked death in the face could know. Then, one morning in early February 1943, their patience was rewarded. Haugland woke first. The storm had passed, and the world outside was still and clear. Then he heard it, faint, distant, but unmistakable, the low drone of engines. He ran to the door and shouted for the others. They rushed out, eyes straining toward the sky. There, black dots against the pale dawn, parachutes blossomed open, drifting gracefully toward the snow. "The new team," Poulsen whispered. "They've come." The 4 men took off through the drifts, moving as fast as their tired legs would carry them. The drop zone was only a few kilometers away, but the terrain was brutal. When they reached it, they found 6 men gathering their gear, lean, determined, dressed in British snow camouflage. At their head was Joachim Rønneberg, calm and confident despite the cold. He extended his hand. "Operation Gunnerside. I believe we're expected." For the first time in months, the men of Grouse felt the crushing weight of isolation lift from their shoulders. Reinforcements, supplies, a plan renewed. Back in their hut that night, the 10 men huddled around the stove, exchanging stories and laughter. For the first time, they felt like an army again, not just survivors. Rønneberg laid out the blueprints of Vemork. "We move soon," he said, "through the ravine, up the gorge, under their noses. No one will see us coming." Poulsen nodded, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "You'll find the way." We've been staring at that fortress for months. Outside, the storm had finally broken. The stars glittered cold and clear above the mountains, and the lights of Vemork gleamed faintly in the distance, unaware that death was already on its way. The men of Grouse had endured hunger, frostbite, and despair. They had fought the mountain and the storm, and survived both. Now, at last, the waiting was over. The wilderness had tested them and found them worthy. Soon it would witness what courage looked like in the heart of winter. The moon hung low over the white expanse of the Hardangervidda Plateau, casting a ghostly light across the snow. The wind had stilled, And in that rare stillness, 10 dark figures moved silently across the frozen world. Their skis whispered over the crust of ice, their breath rising in small clouds that vanished into the night. Each man carried a heavy pack, weapons, explosives, rations, and something far heavier still, the weight of a nation's hope. At the front was Joachim Rønneberg, the young leader of Operation Gunnerside, his jaw set and eyes scanning the terrain ahead. Behind him followed Kasper Edlund, Fredrik Kaiser, Knuts Haukelid, Birger Strömsheim, Hans Storhaug, and the 4 survivors of Operation Grouse: Poulsen, Kjellstrup, Helberg, and Haugland. Together, they were 10 men bound by a single purpose: to strike at the very heart of Hitler's nuclear dream. The night air was razor-sharp, biting through layers of wool and leather. Every step across that plateau was a battle. Snow hissed under their skis, and the cold gnawed at their faces until their skin burned. But they pressed on, driven by an invisible fire, the knowledge that deep in the valley below, the Germans were producing the heavy water that could one day change the course of humanity. Rønneberg called for a halt. The men crouched behind a ridge, catching their breath. Far to the east, the faint glow of Rjukan's lights shimmered like a mirage. The factory at Vemork stood somewhere beyond that glow, massive, fortified, and alive with guards. Haugland adjusted his pack, his breath coming in sharp bursts. "We'll never get a second chance," he said quietly. Rønneberg nodded. "Then we make this one count." They rested briefly, chewing on frozen biscuits and sipping from flasks of tea that had long since turned cold. Around them, the mountains loomed like ancient sentinels, silent witnesses to what was about to unfold. For months, the Gunnerside team had trained in the Scottish Highlands for this moment. They had learned to navigate by starlight, to survive on snow and silence, to strike and vanish without a trace. Now, at last, their training met its test. As they descended from the plateau, the terrain grew treacherous. The snow gave way to steep slopes and frozen gullies. They moved in single file, following Rønneberg's lead, each man trusting the one ahead with his life. Below them, they could see the faint outline of the Mona River Gorge, a black scar cutting through the white landscape. Somewhere in that darkness stood the Vemork plant. Their target. They made camp in a hollow near the tree line, concealing themselves beneath the snow. The air smelled faintly of pine and ice. Around a small shielded flame, Rønneberg unfolded the map one last time. "The plant sits here," he said, tracing the line of the gorge with a gloved finger. "The main bridge is guarded, and there's a floodlight on the south wall. But here, along the railway line, there's an old cable tunnel. The Germans won't expect anyone to come through it. We use that to cross," Helberg frowned. "That's a 100-meter drop. If the ice gives way, then we fall," Rønneberg said evenly. "But it's our only way in." The men nodded. No one needed to be told what was at stake. The next night, the blizzard cleared, and the saboteurs began their descent toward the gorge. Snow crunched underfoot, and the air stung their lungs. They moved without light, guided only by memory and instinct. Every sound felt magnified. The creak of skis, the whisper of wind through the trees, the pounding of their own hearts. When they reached the edge of the gorge, they saw it for the first time. Vemork. It was even more formidable than they'd imagined. The hydroelectric plant stood on a rocky ledge across the river, its tall walls lit by floodlights, the windows glowing orange against the snow. A suspension bridge spanned the ravine, narrow and deadly. Guards patrolled the approaches, rifles slung across their shoulders. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Rønneberg whispered, "We go around." They crept downstream, where the gorge narrowed. The only way across was over the frozen river far below. The descent was nearly vertical, ice, rock, and sheer drop. Using ropes and pickaxes, they climbed down in silence, boots slipping on the icy walls. The roar of the river echoed faintly through the canyon. At one point, Eidlund's foot slipped, sending a shower of snow into the darkness. He caught himself, breath rasping in his throat. No one said a word. Each man knew that a single noise could give them away. At last, they reached the bottom. The river was frozen solid, a slick, glassy expanse of blue-black ice. They crossed one at a time, testing each step before committing their weight. The sound of their boots against the ice seemed deafening in the stillness. On the far side, they began the climb up toward the plant. The snow was deeper here and the slope brutal. When they finally reached the edge of the railway line, their muscles burned and their hands were raw. Above them, only a few meters away, stood the outer wall of Vemork. It was nearly midnight. Rønneberg signaled for the group to halt. The men crouched low, listening. A German voice called out faintly in the distance, a guard on patrol. Then silence again. They crawled forward, reaching a small gate in the fence. Haukelid produced a pair of wire cutters, their metal muffled with cloth. Slowly, painstakingly, he snipped through the fence. One by one, the men slipped inside the compound. Every movement was deliberate, rehearsed. They avoided the light, hugging the shadows of the buildings. When they reached the basement entrance, Kaiser knelt and began working on the lock. His hands were steady despite the cold. Within seconds, the door clicked open. The men filed in, closing it softly behind them. The air inside was warm and smelled faintly of oil and metal. They were in. In the dim light, they found the electrolysis chamber, a maze of pipes, valves, and massive steel tanks filled with heavy water. The machinery hummed with a low, steady vibration. Rønneberg's heart pounded. This was it, the beating heart of Hitler's atomic ambition. Kaiser and Strumsheim set to work placing the charges. Each one was small, precise, designed to destroy the chambers without killing the workers upstairs. They worked quickly, whispering instructions, their gloves slick with sweat despite the cold. 15-second delay, Kaiser said. That's all we need. When the last charge was set, Rønneberg took one last look around. Ready? They nodded. He pressed the detonator timer, then turned to the others. Move. They slipped back through the tunnels, retracing their steps toward the gorge. The night was utterly silent. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, a deep, rolling explosion. The mountain shook, and a dull orange glow lit the sky behind them. The sound rolled through the valley like thunder. The men paused only briefly, staring back at the blaze. The heavy water chambers, gone. Rønneberg allowed himself a rare smile. That'll slow them down. By dawn, they were miles away, climbing back into the safety of the mountains. The Germans had launched a massive search, dogs and patrols scouring the valleys, but the saboteurs moved faster, ghosts on skis, swallowed by the wilderness. When word reached London days later, the news electrified the Allies. The Vemork plant was crippled, its production of heavy water halted. In a single night, 10 men had changed the trajectory of the atomic race. For Norway, it was more than a victory. It was a statement. Against the machinery of tyranny, courage still had meaning. As the sun rose over the snowbound plateau, the saboteurs pressed on, leaving no trace but their tracks, fleeting marks in the white silence of history. The mountains were still dark when the first German guard arrived at the Vemork plant, rubbing his hands against the biting cold. The night shift had ended without incident, or so it seemed. The lights in the main building flickered faintly, the turbines still thrumming below the ground. But something was off. There was a faint metallic smell in the air, a tang of oil and smoke that didn't belong in the crisp Norwegian dawn. He descended into the basement to investigate. For a moment, he thought he saw a thin thread of smoke curling up from beneath one of the heavy water tanks. He frowned, took a step closer. Then the world erupted. A roar tore through the concrete chamber, a deep, shattering concussion that rattled the entire mountain. The blast sent a plume of steam and debris shooting into the air, shattering glass, tearing pipes from the walls. Flames licked up the stairwell as alarms wailed through the plant. By the time the guards staggered outside, coughing, the other workers were already shouting, scrambling into the snow. Above them, the once stoic walls of Vemork glowed orange in the dim light of dawn. The Germans were screaming orders, weapons drawn, unsure what had happened. Somewhere deep in the smoke and chaos, the lifeblood of their atomic project was spilling away into the frozen earth. Hours earlier, 10 men had crouched in that very chamber, their breath fogging the air as they worked by the dim glow of flashlights. Joachim Rønneberg had knelt beside the main electrolysis unit, watching as Frederick Kaiser and Birger Strumsheim attached the final explosive charge to the base of the heavy water cells. The plan was meticulous, every step rehearsed 100 times in their minds. The explosives had to destroy the equipment beyond repair, yet cause minimal loss of life. This wasn't vengeance. It was precision. The hum of the machinery vibrated through the floor. The faint hiss of valves and the ticking of the timer made the silence even heavier. Rønneberg looked up at the tangle of wires that controlled the power flow through the tanks, the network that fed the plant's heart. "This is it," he whispered. Kaiser nodded. Once this cable is gone, so is their dream. The single cable ran from the main control panel to the electrolysis chamber, regulating the current that separated the hydrogen isotopes. Without it, the process would collapse instantly. The Germans could replace tanks, rebuild valves, but not the weeks, months, years of work that this one cut would destroy. Rønneberg drew his knife. The blade gleamed faintly in the low light. He hesitated only for a heartbeat, then pressed it against the wire. There was a soft snap. A spark jumped, and a thin trail of smoke curled upward. The cable sagged, severed cleanly in two. "Let's finish it," he said. They planted the final charges, checked the timers, 30 seconds. Rønneberg took a deep breath, the air thick with oil and adrenaline. Then he looked to his men. Time to disappear. They moved fast and silent through the corridor, the sound of boots muffled by snow as they slipped out into the night. Behind them, deep inside the belly of the plant, the timer ticked its final seconds. Then came the thunder. The ground beneath their feet trembled. A shock wave rippled through the valley, bouncing off the mountains. The men turned to see a column of fire and smoke rising from the factory roof. Even from a distance, they could hear the metallic groan of collapsing steel. Kaiser laughed under his breath, shaking his head. "God, we actually did it." Rønneberg didn't smile. His eyes stayed fixed on the fire. "Let's move." They'll be swarming within minutes. They vanished into the darkness, ghosts retreating into the snow. At dawn, the German garrison in Rjukan launched a full-scale manhunt. Troops poured into the mountains, their dogs sniffing for tracks. Aircraft circled overhead. But the saboteurs had already scattered. Some heading for Sweden, others deeper into the plateau where only Norwegians knew how to survive. From London, British intelligence listened to the first intercepted reports. Sabotage at Vemork. Heavy water destroyed. Production halted indefinitely. The room fell silent. Then someone whispered, "They did it?" In a single night, the Allies had struck a crippling blow to Hitler's atomic ambitions. Without heavy water, the Nazi nuclear program would grind to a halt. Months of work, millions of marks, and countless man-hours gone. But in Norway, the victory was far from celebrated. The reprisals began within days. German troops arrested dozens of workers, interrogated townspeople, even executed suspected collaborators. The people of Rønneberg lived in fear, but the saboteurs, hidden among them or lost in the wilderness, knew they could never be caught alive. Deep in a snow-covered cave, the Gunnerside team gathered, exhausted but alive. Their faces were pale, lips cracked, eyes rimmed red from sleepless nights. Rations were running low. Rønneberg sat near the small fire, his hands trembling slightly as he poured melted snow into a tin cup. He looked at his men, the frostbitten faces, the cracked smiles, and felt something stir in his chest. "They'll rebuild," said Haugland quietly. "You know they will." "Germans never give up," Rønneberg nodded. "Maybe, but it won't matter. We've set them back a year, maybe more. By then, it'll be too late." Outside, the wind howled across the plateau. The men huddled closer to the fire, the faint warmth of fragile comfort against the cold that ruled their land. Later that night, as they slept in shifts, Haugland stood guard near the cave entrance. The aurora shimmered faintly across the sky, green ribbons dancing above the mountains. He thought of the factory far below. The ruins, the twisted metal, the crater still smoking in the dawn. For the first time since the occupation began, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope. Down in the valley, the Germans struggled to contain the damage. The electrolysis chambers were ruined, the heavy water destroyed or contaminated. Engineers cursed and argued as SS officers prowled the wreckage, barking orders. Major Kurt Diebner, one of the physicists overseeing the project, arrived days later from Berlin. His face was ashen as he walked among the charred remains. "All of it," an engineer stammered. "Gone." Every cell. Diebner knelt beside a twisted cable, blackened and half melted. He picked it up, staring at it as if it were a dead snake. "One cable," he murmured. "One damned cable." He knew what it meant. The Reich's dream of an atomic weapon, already struggling under resource shortages and Allied bombings, had suffered a mortal wound. Without Norway's heavy water, their nuclear experiments would slow to a crawl. That night, a report landed on Hitler's desk in the Wolf's Lair. He read it silently, his face expressionless. When he finished, he slammed the papers down, sending his teacups shattering to the floor. "Sabotage," he spat. "Norwegian dogs." But even his fury couldn't change the truth. Somewhere deep in the Norwegian wilderness, a handful of men had cut a single cable, and with it, severed the thread that could have led to a nuclear apocalypse. Spring came slowly to Telemark. The snow melted from the pines, revealing the scars of war, burned outposts, cratered roads, shattered rail lines. Yet the mountains still stood, silent and eternal, holding the secrets of what had happened there. In a small farmhouse on the outskirts of Rønneberg, an old woman hung laundry in the yard. She looked up toward the gorge, where the factory still stood, its smokestacks quiet. somewhere beyond that, unseen, the resistance fighters were on the move again. The wind carried the faint echo of a distant explosion, perhaps from a German patrol testing new charges in the valley. Or perhaps it was memory. The memory of that one night when courage and frostbitten hands had changed the course of history. As the Allied planes thundered toward Berlin 2 years later, Rønneberg sat in exile in Britain, listening to the BBC broadcast of the D-Day invasion. He thought of his homeland, of the men he'd left behind, and of the snowbound silence of Vemork. He smiled faintly. All that, he murmured, because of one cable. The man beside him, an RAF officer, looked up. You cut the line that killed their bomb. Rønneberg didn't answer. He didn't need to. The world already knew, high in the frozen peaks of Telemark, the echoes of that single act still lingered. The knife's soft whisper, the spark in the dark, the explosion that shattered a dictator's dream and saved a world from the fire he meant to unleash. The snow had begun to melt in Telemark, but the air still carried the sharp bite of winter. The river that wound through Rønneberg flowed swift and cold, carrying with it the remnants of ice and war. Months had passed since the explosion at Vemork, and though the smoke had long since faded, the shockwaves still rippled through Nazi command. In Berlin, the High Command refused to surrender their dream. The loss of the heavy water had crippled production, but German engineers were relentless. Under the orders of the Reich Ministry for Armaments, what remained of the precious substance, dozens of barrels salvaged and newly processed, was to be shipped to Germany. It would be the foundation of a renewed nuclear effort. That cargo was loaded, under the watchful eyes of SS guards, onto a ferry named Hydro. It was a sturdy Norwegian vessel built to cross the icy expanse of Lake Tinnsjå, the deep mountain lake that mirrored the gray skies above. The barrels, sealed and disguised as ordinary cargo, were stored in the lower deck. To the untrained eye, it was just another supply shipment. To the resistance, it was the last thread of Hitler's nuclear hope. In a small wooden cabin, hidden deep in the woods near Rønneberg, Knut Haukelid leaned over a crude map spread across a table. The light of a kerosene lamp flickered over his face, casting long shadows against the walls. Around him sat 3 other men from the Norwegian resistance, their expressions grim and determined. This is it, Haukelid said quietly, tapping the map where the lake narrowed near Mel. The ferry departs at dawn. Once it reaches the deepest part of the lake, here, it'll be gone forever. One of the younger men, Arne Kittelsen, swallowed hard. There'll be civilians on board. Workers, families? Haukelid's eyes were cold, but not without sorrow. I know. But if those barrels reach Germany, they could finish what Vemork began. One ferry or the world, that's the choice we have. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the wind, rattling the window panes. The men had been debating the operation for weeks. The British had confirmed intelligence that the Germans were moving the remaining heavy water south. The Allies couldn't risk an airstrike. It would be too obvious, too deadly. The task, once again, fell to the Norwegians. A handful of men, armed with a few explosives, would decide the fate of one of the most secret cargoes in the war. The night before the attack was eerily still. The sky was moonless, the lake a sheet of black glass reflecting only the faint outlines of the surrounding mountains. Haukelid and his small team made their way along the frozen path toward the ferry terminal at Mel. Each man carried a pack with tools, explosives, and rope. They wore dark wool coats and soft-soled boots, their faces hidden by scarves. The ferry sat moored to the dock, her hull groaning softly against the ice. A few guards stood at the gangplank, their breath visible in the cold air. Inside the cargo hold, the barrels lay chained in place, each marked with coded German insignia. Haukelid crouched behind a stack of crates near the shoreline, waiting for the last light in the terminal to go dark. His heart pounded. Every operation before this, Gunnerside, Vemork, had been dangerous. But this one carried a different weight. The explosion they planned would send not just steel and water skyward, but also innocent souls. He whispered to his men, "No mistakes. We go in, set the charge, and leave before anyone knows we were here." They moved like shadows, slipping down the dock. The cold bit through their gloves as they climbed into the lower deck through a service hatch. The air inside smelled of diesel and iron. Haukelid led the way, his flashlight dimmed to a sliver. He could hear the faint creak of the ferry's hull as the lake ice shifted. Every sound echoed like a gunshot in the dark. They found the barrels stacked near the center of the hold. Dozens of them, each sealed tight. It was enough heavy water to restart the Nazi project 10 times over. Haukelid knelt and began placing the explosives along the hull, directly below the cargo. The timer was a simple device, mechanical but reliable. He adjusted the setting to detonate in the middle of the lake when the ferry reached its deepest point, some 1,300 feet of icy water beneath. There would be no salvage, no recovery. As he worked, Kittelsen whispered, "How long until detonation?" "About 30 minutes after departure," Haukelid replied. "It'll happen quick. No one will have time to panic." He paused, his gloved hand resting on the cold metal of a barrel. "God forgive us," he murmured. When the charges were set, the men retraced their steps, climbing back into the night. By the time they disappeared into the forest, the ferry sat quietly in the dark, its secret ticking away unseen. Morning came gray and heavy with fog. The crew of the Hydro went about their tasks unaware of the fate awaiting them. Passengers boarded, workers, a few German soldiers, even families returning to the mainland. Children laughed as they stepped onto the deck, their voices carrying faintly over the water. At precisely 10:45 a.m., the ferry cast off. Its engine rumbled to life, pushing the vessel slowly into the mist that hung low over Lake Tinnsjå. From a ridge high above the shoreline, Haukelid watched through binoculars. His breath came out in small clouds as he followed the ferry's progress across the water. Around him, the others stood silently, their faces pale. The Hydro cut through the fog, its wake spreading across the still surface like a scar. Minutes passed. Then, at the point where the lake reached its deepest stretch, Haukelid lowered the binoculars and waited. There was a brief, terrible stillness. Then, at exactly the 30th minute, the lake erupted. A deep boom rolled through the valley, followed by a geyser of water and smoke that shot high into the air. The sound echoed between the mountains, carrying for miles. When the spray cleared, the ferry was gone. Only shattered wood and debris floated where she had been. Haukelid closed his eyes. Around him, no one spoke. They could hear distant shouts, the faint cries of survivors clinging to wreckage in the freezing water. "The cargo?" Kittelsen asked. Haukelid nodded grimly. "It's gone. All of it." For days afterward, the Germans scoured the lake. Divers searched the depths but found nothing. The barrels had vanished into the black silence of the abyss. Reports were written, accusations flew, and suspicions turned inward. The Germans refused to believe that the resistance could have done it again. But the truth whispered through the occupied towns. The Norwegians had sunk Hitler's last hope. Word reached London soon after. The message was brief, sent in code. Cargo lost. Lake secure. At British intelligence headquarters, the analysts exchanged stunned glances. The message was forwarded straight to the Prime Minister. Churchill reportedly read it twice, then leaned back and said softly, "Good. The world owes Norway another debt." In Telemark, the lake eventually froze over again, sealing the wreckage beneath a mirror of ice. The fishermen who lived along its shores spoke of hearing strange sounds from below, the groan of metal, the whisper of ghosts. But they never knew what truly slept at the bottom. For Haukelid and the others, there was no celebration. They went back to their hideouts, back to the long grind of survival. War still raged across Europe, and their victory, though decisive, was a secret one. Yet, on cold nights, when the wind swept down from the mountains, Haukelid would think of that morning, the sight of the ferry slipping into the fog, the thunder that followed, and he would remember the weight of what they'd done. Sometimes, when he closed his eyes, he could still see the ripples spreading across the lake. Years later, when the war was over and peace returned to Norway, divers finally reached the wreck of the hydro. The barrels were still there, intact but harmless, resting in the cold darkness. The story spread slowly, piece by piece, until the world finally learned the truth that a handful of Norwegians, armed with nothing but courage and conviction, had stopped the Nazi atomic project for good. Above Lake Tinnsjå, the mountains stood silent, their peaks wreathed in mist. The lake lay still once more, its surface reflecting the sky like glass. And somewhere in that reflection, perhaps, the faintest echo of that explosion lingered, a whisper across time, reminding the world that sometimes history turns not on armies or empires, but on the quiet bravery of a few who dared to act. The war was burning itself out. Across Europe, the thunder of artillery was giving way to silence, to ruins, to ghosts. The mighty Reich that once stretched from the Arctic to the Mediterranean was collapsing in on itself. In the east, the Red Army poured through the snow like a relentless tide. In the west, Allied bombers reduced German cities to ash. And in the north, high in the mountains of Norway, the echoes of Defiance still lingered, quiet, cold, and eternal. Telemark, 1945. The heavy snows had come early that year. The valleys were buried beneath a white hush, and the mountains rose like great frozen sentinels. The Vemork plant still stood, scarred but unbroken, its walls stained with the black memory of the explosion that had once crippled Hitler's atomic ambitions. The Germans still held it, though it no longer mattered. The machinery was silent, the tanks empty, the cables dead. For all their might, for all their science, the Germans had been undone by a handful of men and a single act of sabotage. Knut Haukelid trudged through the snow along the edge of the gorge, his rifle slung across his back. The war had changed since those first desperate days. The Allies were winning now. D-Day had come and gone. France was free. Berlin was burning on the horizon of history. But in the frozen stillness of Norway, the occupation still cast its long shadow. He stopped on a ridge overlooking the lake. Beneath the sheet of ice lay the wreck of the Ferry hydro, the final resting place of barrels that might have changed the world. The surface was frozen solid now, smooth as glass, reflecting the gray sky. As the wind swept across it, he could almost hear the faint echo of that explosion, still rolling through the water years later. Behind him, a young courier approached, his breath fogging in the cold. "There's news from London," he said, handing over a folded message. Haukelid opened it, scanning the coded lines. His eyes narrowed. "It's over," he murmured. "Over?" Germany's surrendering. They've lost. The words hung in the frozen air like something too fragile to touch. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then Haukelid looked out across the lake again. Somewhere beneath that ice lay not just the wreck of a ship, but the wreck of an empire's ambition. He remembered the faces of the men he'd fought beside. Rønneberg, Kaiser, Strumsheim, the heroes of Gunnerside. Some were still alive, hiding in the hills or scattered across Europe. Others were gone. But the memory of that night, the moment the cable was cut, still burned bright in his mind. Months later, as the snow melted and the occupiers fled, the resistance came out of the forests and the mountains. They emerged thin, hollow-eyed and sunburned, but victorious. Towns that had long whispered in fear now shouted with joy. The Norwegian flag, hidden for 5 bitter years, was raised once more above Rjukan. Rønneberg returned home a hero, though he never called himself one. He walked through the streets he had left as a fugitive, now filled with the laughter of children and the ring of church bells. Yet even in that triumph, there was a quiet sorrow. So many had died. So much had been lost. One evening, he visited the plateau where it had all begun. The wind cut across the snow, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and smoke. He stood at the edge of the gorge, looking down toward Vemork, its tall chimneys silhouetted against the fading light. The factory was quiet now. The Germans were gone. Only the ruins of twisted steel and blackened stone remained, the remains of a dream that had died in the cold. He closed his eyes and remembered the night they had gone in. The creak of the bridge, the cold burn of metal under his hands, the soft snap of the cable. One cut, one explosion, and history had shifted. If they had failed that night, he thought, the war might have ended differently. Perhaps Berlin would have fallen under a different kind of fire. The blinding flash of an atomic bomb. Perhaps London, Moscow, or even New York would have burned beneath a mushroom cloud born in these mountains. But they had not failed. The cable had been cut. The dream had died here, in the heart of Norway. In the years that followed, the world moved on. The war became stories, then memories, then lines in a textbook. Scientists built new reactors, new weapons, new fears. The atomic age dawned not in Berlin, but in the deserts of New Mexico, where the Americans succeeded in the race Hitler had lost. Yet even in that triumph, the shadow of Norway lingered. The reminder that the line between victory and destruction is sometimes drawn not by armies, but by courage. Rønneberg and his men returned to quiet lives. They seldom spoke of what they'd done. When journalists came asking, they told their stories simply, without drama. "We had a job to do," Rønneberg would say. "We did it." But sometimes, in the stillness of night, he would dream of that cable again. The knife's edge cutting through darkness, the flash of sparks, the explosion that followed. He would wake with the sound of the blast still echoing in his ears. He once told a friend, years later, "The snow never forgets. Everything we did up there, it's still written in the ice." In 1965, divers finally located the wreck of the Hydro, deep in Lake Tinnsjå. The barrels were found resting in silence, their labels still faintly visible beneath decades of silt. Scientists confirmed what history had long known. The heavy water had been real, and the mission had changed everything. News spread around the world. Newspapers called it one of the most successful sabotage operations in history. Historians called it the act that may have saved civilization. But in Norway, among the peaks of Telemark, the story was never told with pride alone. It was told with reverence. For the lives lost, the choices made, and the cost of what it took to stop an empire. On the 50th anniversary of the operation, an aging Knut Haukelid returned to the lake. His hair was white, his hands thin, his step unsteady. But his eyes were as sharp as ever. He stood on the shore as the wind whipped across the water, the same wind that had carried the sound of the ferry's final explosion half a century earlier. He looked out at the calm surface and smiled faintly. Beside him, a young journalist asked softly, "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't done it?" Haukelid nodded. "Every day." He paused, his gaze fixed on the lake. "But it doesn't matter now. The war ended, and the world still stands. That's enough." He took a slow breath, the air cold and sharp, then added, almost to himself, "The ice remembers." Today, the factory at Vemork still stands, a museum now, not of war, but of warning. Visitors walk through its corridors and see the machinery that once promised destruction. They read about the men who came in the night and vanished into the snow. Outside, the wind howls through the mountains, carrying whispers of the past. Sometimes, when the light hits the gorge just right, locals say you can still see the faint outline of tracks leading away from the plant. Ski marks frozen into time, disappearing into the white horizon. They lead nowhere and everywhere. The world remembers wars by their battles, by their generals, by their flags. But in the story of Norway, the victory was carved not by armies, but by courage born in silence. 10 men, a knife, and a single cable had changed the course of history, and in the frozen heart of Telemark, beneath the snow and the ice, the echoes of that courage still remain, faint but eternal, carried by the wind, whispering across the mountains. Freedom was bought here.